So hosting the webinar today is myself, Mark Ryan. I'm the Director of Sales for SES. And we've also got Martin White, who's our technical lead for Control Point. We're aiming for 45-minute window. So we're not taking everyone away for too long. But there will be a Q&A session for those that do wish to hang around towards the end. But some of the topic points that we'll be covering, we'll be discussing many of the issues that organizations are facing in today's sort of data and informational challenges, the reasons behind them, and ultimately the consequences of each, and then how our data profile and file analytics platform Control Point solves those issues. And some of the areas in particular will be the locating and indexing of PII data, managing DSAR requests, so data subject access requests, migrating to the cloud, cleaning up legacy data, and ultimately the reduction of unstructured data and automating policies and many other things as well.
Okay, well, I'll take over. So thanks, Mark, for that introduction. And good morning, everybody. My name is Martin White, as Mark said. I'm the technical lead for our solution. And our solution is very much based on a product or using a product called Control Point to manage unstructured data. So all that data that lives outside of an RDB, a relational database. So all that back office data, so things like Word documents, Excel spreadsheet, JPEG files, everything that's outside of a database. As a quick introduction to me, I suppose, some of my background, I've worked with inside the IT industry for a long time, several years. Originally, I worked for Hewlett-Packard in their software division, where I was a software consultant, so delivering solutions for customers all around data management. And I worked for a few other companies, IT companies, so Brocade, QLogic, based around storage and the use of data. And what we spotted, or what I spotted over a number of years ago, was that there was a massive growth in unstructured data and the need to start to manage that data. So that's very much where we've formed our solution, really to help customers address that challenge and really to understand what data they have out there. Because what we've seen is that many organisations over the years sort of adopted a policy of we'll keep it just in case. And of course, that just in case time just never happened. And as time moved on, people would forget what the data was there for and again, just keep it just in case. So there was just a gradual and continual increase in the amount of unstructured data. And now with solutions like we're going to go through today, it really allows customers to start to address those challenges and manage that data going forward. So in the next 40 minutes or 35 minutes, I'm going to take you through our solution and some of the particular problems we have addressed for some of our customers around DSARs, around managing their data, being able to possibly defer a purchase of a storage purchase because they can tidy up their data and retrieve some capacity. The ability to secure their data, and one of the things which we'll go through in the user case is the ability to almost proactively manage access to data files, to documents, and if necessary, change that access level. So that involves defining who can have access to files, but even encrypting the documents as well. So as we go forward, really just a bit of another recap. So we've seen security has always been on everybody or every company's profile. And in the early days, it was probably based around perimeter security, so firewalls. But we've seen identity and access management becoming more important, endpoint security, application security with the exchange of secure tokens. And really that's all been governed around protecting one of the biggest assets most organizations have, and that's their data. So we've seen data governance and protection become more important to many organizations and really move up that stack and become a discussion point at the very top of organizations. 2018, we saw the introduction of this thing called GDPR, which I gather most of you are probably aware of, and we saw several organisations take advantage of GDPR to really sort of change some of their operating practices and their procedures, and really to get their house in order, I suppose. But we've also seen an increase, definitely in 2019, and I think continuing through this year, in the area of data subject access requests, where individuals are requesting companies to provide them with what information they actually have on them at the current time. So really today, we're going to focus on two user cases. One, it's all around how can we secure and protect information to make sure our valuable assets are protected. And then also we'll take a slightly different view with actually we've got a data subject access request. How do we actually address that? And for those who are not aware, that a data subject access request really can come from two sources. First, it could be a consumer to business, where a consumer has purchased a product and has requested a company to ask what information they actually are holding on that individual. And that tends to be more straightforward because most of that information is held inside the central sales database, inside the CRM system. The second and more complicated DSAR request comes from an internal employee. Maybe there's maybe someone's been made redundant, or there's a disgruntled employee, or there's a dispute, and that employee is asked for what information is held on them. And of course, that information resides across the back office environment. So, information in file shares, SharePoint, OneDrive, emails, so it could be in the email system. And we've worked with one particular customer where they had a major problem in addressing a DSARS because it was just taking a very long time. Bear in mind that the 30 days requirement still, exists irrespective of where the requesting body is coming from. So we worked with them to formulate a solution to really help them address their DSAR requirements. And that's what I'm going to take you through again today. If anything, hopefully you'll leave this webinar today with the opportunity to go and ask anybody you're working with, how do you do this as well? Because we found that it was definitely a major overhead and for them to respond to a DSAR, and it cost them a lot of money, a lot of time. So we'll go through that today, and I'll actually show you that during the demonstration. So what does our solution actually look like? Well, as Mark mentioned, we actually use a product called Control Point. Control Point is a software solution provided by a company called Micro Focus. Originally, Control Point was a Hewlett-Packard software product, and probably around about 4 years ago, Hewlett-Packard and Micro Focus formed a partnership where it was a spin merger. So the software division basically moved across to Micro Focus. So Control Point, which is the solution for managing unstructured data, is really branded now under the Micro Focus umbrella. Control Point really has three phases or three stages. The first stage is all around discovery. So you're discovering the data and you're ingesting the data into Control Point. Now, when I say ingestion, it doesn't mean we're taking a copy of the data. So we're simply ingesting some metadata or some content indexes to that data, which we can use to do additional classification and categorization at the next stage. So stage one is that we perform an ingestion across different sources. So there could be a source which will be your file shares. Another source could be SharePoint. Another source could be your email system, OneDrive, etc., etc. So once your data has been ingested, we can then move on to the second stage, which is all around classification, building those business rules that allows you to, if you like, perform some analytics on your ingested data. So a good example here would be, for example, if you wanted to identify any duplicate files or any files that haven't been accessed in a long extended period of time. So maybe you could use the system to almost justify deferring that storage purchase. Or maybe you want to identify all that PII information that might reside across your multiple streams of data. Maybe you want to find all those credit card numbers, all those personal names, or those CV documents that might be throughout the organisation. The third and final stage, which is act, and this is really where we take action. So based on our classifications, based on our business rules, we can actually perform some actions. Those actions could be, for example, to move files from one location to another location. It could be to add additional metadata tag to those files that we can use for later processing. In our case, we've actually extended Control Point to enable Control Point to perform some form of encryption. So it actually, we've formed a very close working relationship with Microsoft to enable us to use their AIP, their Azure Information Protection capability, to encrypt files and change access rights to files. So there's lots of facilities that we can use Control Point really to scale out and perform those integrations to give added value to our customers. So let's just go through in a bit more detail so I can just set the scene for our user cases, which we're going to try to demonstrate today in our live environment. So there's really three kind of areas I'm going to show you, and that's only due to the limitations in time. So the first area is really, I'm just going to give you an example where how can we use Control Point to very simply identify the number of duplicate files, and a duplicate file is based on the content. If the content is identical, irrespective of what the file is called, who owns the file, or where it's located, if the contents are identical, well, that's a duplicate. So how do we identify those files? And maybe also, how do we identify files that haven't been accessed in an extended period of time, maybe more than 5 years? So just giving you an example of how we can interact with Control Point to provide that and to get that information, which we can then use to take some action. We're also going to show you how we've integrated with, I mentioned before, Azure Information Protection, AIP, to enable us to protect files, encrypt files. They've got a user case for this actually was necessary because we have a customer who had some very well-defined procedures for their users, and depending on what their users were creating, if the files contained sensitive information or company IP information, then it had to be saved in a certain location and had to be assigned certain access privileges. The question was, well, are the users actually doing that? Are our assets protected? So we use Control Point almost like to police the environment, where it would access the contents, it would perform a search on the contents of files, and if the protection or the location of the file was incorrect, it could then make a modification to the document, and in this case, for example, encrypt the file if necessary. The final stage, which we're going to touch on and just give you that user case where I mentioned before, we had a customer who had a DSAR, an internal DSAR request, and had some quite severe problems just trying to manage and process the email capability, and that will show you as well in some detail. I did mention ingestion, and that always causes a lot of customers to take a bit of a gasp in breath, because when we talk about ingestion, a lot of people think we're taking a copy of the data, and we're not. We can perform several types of ingestion inside Control Point. One of them is metadata only, and that simply is we extract the metadata, the header information from the documents. So that type of information would be obviously the name of the document, the owner, the size, the access date, but we can also extract any application metadata that might be assigned to the file. A good example is Word. So if you create a Word or an Excel document, usually within inside Word or Excel, the file will be created with the original person who created the file. So that kind of information we can also extract, and that would be usable with inside Control Point. So we can search on that information if necessary. Depending on your requirements, if you want to then do some low level, some additional searching and filtering based on PII information, the contents of the file, then we can extend the metadata ingestion to include a content index. Well, this will allow us to search the not only the metadata, but also the contents of the files. So, for example, we could easily identify things like credit card numbers, personal names, or maybe there's some internal reference numbers or requirements within your business that we can easily identify and pull together that information to make it more manageable and give you visibility of that information. Before we go into the demo, just to give you a few examples of some of the screenshots, so you have some familiarity with what we're going to see. And here's something that this screenshot basically shows: a ROT analysis. And ROT stands for redundant, obsolete, and trivial. So redundant is basically the duplicate files. So number of files which are got the identical content. Obsolete is all based on our system. It's been configured to be any files that haven't been modified or accessed in 5 or more years. And that's user configurable. So that's very much down to your particular environments or your procedures that you might have in place. Trivial is really are documents that shouldn't really exist on our SAN or our corporate SAN. So, but I just want to know if they do exist, and if so, I can track them. I can keep an eye on them, and if necessary, I can take some action. And that's what trivial files are. All user definable for your particular environment. A few other examples, and this is just showing how we can interact with Control Point to get some information from the system. Most of the time, Control Point will be in the background just controlling the system for you. Once obviously the business rules are set up and the policies are running, it will quite happily manage the system for you. But you also have that facility to interact with Control Point to extract the information. So very quickly, on the top left-hand corner, the larger sort of screenshot, the system will automatically perform almost like a classification. It will group all the files together into common types of files. So what do I mean by that? So if you look along the very top, you will see something that says archive, audio backup, and eventually you almost see something that says document or docu. So the docu will be created by the system, and it's just a collection of all the word processing type documents. So for example, in there will be all the Word documents, the PDFs, the rich text formats, and so on. So this just gives you a method of visually seeing the makeup of your data and what type of data you have. And you can interact with the system. So any of those bars you could click on to drill down to actually see the location and the type and the owner of the files. Other screenshots that we've got available in the system where we can look at the files by user, how files have been added over time. So you see it in the middle, almost at the bottom, we can see the addition rate, where this is the amount of capacity that's been consumed on a yearly basis by files that have been created. Usually we find in most customer environments, every 3 years you see almost a spike where there's been some form of technology refresh, or there's been a consolidation or some IT servers or something, and we've seen a spike in the amount of data that's been used. Finally, in the bottom left-hand corner, we have almost like a spectrograph, a heat map, whatever you like to call it really. It's a content visualization. So it allows the system will automatically, based upon the content of the files, and obviously this is dependent upon the type of ingestion you've performed, it will collect files together that have a similar meaning. So the content of the documents have a similar meaning. So the little red dots represent groupings of files which have a very close meaning. The documents are very, very similar. So obviously the closer the dots together, the red dots are together, the files have a very close relationship. The further the dots apart, then the relationship is less strong. This is a way where the system is really using its AI capability, which has probably been extended throughout the years, really to help you understand the makeup of your data and help you along the classification process. So from this screen, you can select the red dots and you can do additional, more granular classification if you wish. Couple more examples before we go into the demonstration, and here's just something that we found that a number of customers found very useful. We created a small bar chart that simply highlights low, medium, and high risk based upon the content of files. So, for example, the low risk, the higher number, the 881, probably represents files that contain one piece of PII, maybe a personal name. If we take an example, if we look for Martin White, that would say that we've got 881 files that contain Martin White. Now, that doesn't really point to me as an individual, because there are thousands of Martin Whites out there. But if we do an additional, a more granular category where we look for two pieces of PII, maybe a personal name and an email address, so suddenly the number becomes lower, but it becomes more defined. It's more direct. Now, when I worked at Hewlett-Packard, there were always 6 Martin Whites at least. So although it doesn't point to necessarily to me as an individual, it's a smaller band of people. So the risk associated is higher. And finally, that the high risk, well, maybe it's 3 pieces of PII: personal name, email address, and maybe a national insurance number or a credit card number. So that's more data that points to an individual. Now this is quite important, because should any data be exposed, then you really need to understand what the risk associated with that data is, so that you can take some control, some proactive actions to make sure that your business is protected still. So the ability to understand the makeup of the data, we're finding a lot of organizations find this very, very useful. I mentioned about the spectrograph as well. So I think Control Point were probably one of the first organizations or first company, or first software product, really to go in the world of artificial intelligence. And this has been extended over the years, and there's lots of additional proximity mathematics that have been included, really for them to try to extract the meaning, the context of files, and then be able to form a relationship between those files. And this is a very strong part of Control Point. And many education facilities find this very useful, because they tend to have lots of research projects which are working on individual items, but some of them have very similar problems. And again, a lot of universities have found this very useful to really pull departments together so they can work on a common source. So that gives you a quick flavour of how you can interact and what Control Point actually looks like. So we're going to go one stage further now, and we're going to go in and show you the system and show it actually working. So I'm going to change my display and go across to Control Point. So Control Point is based on a Windows .NET framework. So there is a portal, so we can browse to Control Point, and provided your AD account has been given access and certain access rights, depending on what you will see with inside Control Point. But there are basically 3 stages to Control Point. As you remember from that presentation, that slide, we said the discover. Well, that's where the repositories are. This is where we do our initial ingestion. So this is where we're defining our sources, whether it's a file share, whether it's in an email exchange system, whether it's a SharePoint environment, whether it's OneDrive. This is where we're defining our data sources and actually starting our ingestions to build that metadata and those content indexes. The second stage in the middle are categories, and this is where we perform our classifications. So this is where we will classify our data and build those business rules. So this is where we'll be defining how we want to search our data and build those connections between our files, so that we can then move on and actually take perform some actions with a policy manager. So the policy manager, for example, could move files, it could add additional metadata tags to the files, or it could encrypt the files. And this is the policies act upon the categories, the business rules that have been defined. That may sound slightly complicated, and hopefully as we go through and I show you some of the examples, it becomes slightly more clear. So first of all, let's go into repositories just to show you what we have defined on our system. So on our system, really, the top 3 are the important ones. So we have the first one on the left, the demo data is just a series of file shares that we've ingested. So we're just ingesting all that back office type data. The second one in the middle is an email system. So we've ingested a number of mailboxes from our 365, from our Azure email system. The system will quite happily ingest data from an on-site Exchange environment, and as well also from Azure. So if you've got both environments where you're doing a migration, Control Point can manage both for you. And lastly, just as an example, we have a OneDrive environment where we're collecting information around files that have been created in OneDrive. The two boxes below that are not so relevant, but just to tell you exactly what's happening, the reference data, which should be spelt reference data. So this simply is a series of documents. In total, it's 10 items, 10 documents that we've created, that we've told the system to use as reference data to go and find all the others that are very similar based upon the content. So we don't, in this case, I didn't want to form the business rules. I didn't want to manually create them. I wanted just to give the system a series of documents and allow the system to go and find all the relevant data for me. And that's just what these two are at the bottom. So I mentioned that we would quickly show you how to look for duplicate files and interact with the system. So I'm just going to show you and take you through that. So I'm going to double click on the demo data, and that should open up. And hopefully you'll remember from the presentation, the ROT analysis. This is the ROT analysis screen that has been created for this ingestion. Here you can see the redundant or the duplicate files, obsolete. This is the age files, and mentioned in our case, it's any files that haven't been changed in 5 or more years. And lastly, the trivial files, files that I just want to keep an eye on to make sure they're not, not building up. And if so, then I'll take some action. Okay, and we'll come back and drill down on those very shortly. I just want to scroll down slightly so I can show you some of the other screens that are on this summary page. Here you'll probably remember, or you probably recall, that this is the amount of data that is being stored in our system over time. On the left-hand side, this is the number of items that have been created. So you can see, and this is our demonstration environment, so it tends to be quite refreshed on a regular basis. So you can see that in 2018, 2019, there were a series of files created, and so on. On the right-hand side, this is the space that's actually occupied by those files. It's really handy in a user environment, because this is where you can, if you want to do some storage capacity planning, or you want to look at the trends over the number of years of how your data has increased, then that's a very easy screen to look at and get that information. I mentioned before around the grouping. So here you can see the grouping of the documents and so on. And again, just gives you a visual representation of the makeup of your data. So it's not based upon the contents. This is just basically based on the file extension. So the type of documents. This is all configurable. So if you had some internal applications that you would develop with their own customized extension, you can add those in quite easily to the system. Lastly, at the very bottom, as I scroll down, we've defined for this particular ingestion that we want to look for some PII information. In our case, we've switched off most of the areas that we can search for. We were just interested in finding personal names. So, things like Martin White, and so on. So this is telling me that there are 943 documents that contain one or more personal names. And again, you can see we can click on this to interact with it to drill down. Same with banking numbers. Here we defined that for this ingestion, we were interested in looking for banking numbers, UK banking numbers, so sort code and bank account numbers. Credit card numbers. So again, based on a 16-digit number, now you can imagine probably the number of false positives that you can actually detect, just based on a pure 16-digit number. Number of Cisco part numbers, for example, can be immense. So what we enabled the system to do was we enhanced the system. So as the ingestion happens and it detects a 16-digit number, we actually validate that 16-digit number as a valid credit card number. If it passed the validation, it's moved forward and that information will be indexed. Hence why, in this case, we haven't got 400, we've only got 1, because it's a real credit card number. And lastly, national insurance numbers. Now this is all customizable. You decide what data, what PII data you want to search for during the initial ingestion. It doesn't mean that if suddenly I realize I want to look for mobile numbers or telephone numbers, that isn't possible, because under the category section, that's where we can still interrogate the data and perform that searching. This is just helping us. So initially, I'm just forming some tags to where this data exists. On the left-hand side, and finally on this screen, I mentioned that we've been working very closely with Microsoft to do some work around their Azure information protection capability. And this is a capability where you can define labels inside Azure, and a lot of the Office-based products like Word, Excel, you can then assign labels to files. And provided users have the correct access qualifiers, they can access those files or not, as the case may be. Now, in our case, we just created some very generalized labels. So we have one called general, personal, public, and this is just showing the number of files that have been assigned to each of those labels. One of the things we're going to show you today is the ability to take a file based upon its content and then change its character, change its label to encrypt the file. So we should see the number of documents under that encryption label increase. Now, just finally to show you how we can just interact with this slightly more detail, I said I would show you how we can find the number of duplicate files. So if we click on duplicates, go down to duplicate sets, and this is just a quick example. Down the left-hand side, these are all the files that have duplicates associated with them. So I'm just going to click on the top one, for example. On the right-hand side, what you would see appearing is the file with the asterisk is the original based upon its creation date, and then the copy. So this is the duplicate copy that's been taken to a different location. And again, we can just scroll down to look at the number of duplicates that we got for each of these duplication sets. Now, let's go back to the summary screen. If we just wanted to know how much space is being occupied by the duplicates, then that number will be represented in the middle of the ROT donut. So when this appears very shortly, I think it's something like 500 megs in our system, which is pretty low. So this is the number of the amount of space that's being occupied by the duplicates. Now, we could have a policy, for example, a category that groups all the duplicates together, and a policy that takes some action. And that action might be to move those duplicate files to a different location before they're finally being disposed of. So we can really tie the whole kind of life cycle back in. The last thing I'll show you before we move on to the user cases in a bit more detail is maybe we want to look at the aging characteristics of our files, and we're more probably interested in the last modification dates. So here we're interacting, and maybe I'm interested just to see the number of files that haven't been accessed or modified in the last 5 or more years. So I can click on that particular bar, and down the right-hand side will be a list of the files. I'm just going to turn the summary off to make it slightly more compact. So here you can see all the files. Now maybe I want to do some additional searching or more granular searching, where I'm only interested in seeing the documents. So any Word, PDF, rich text format files that might be, within inside this area. And again, if I wanted to, maybe I want to assign a piece of metadata to these files to say, okay, these should be removed. The reason they're obsolete and they're old. So I'm not, all I'm defining is some metadata I'm assigning to those files. I'm not taking any action on them, but I could have a category that will pull together all the files with those metadata tags, and then a policy that takes some action to remove those files if necessary. But I'm simply tagging the files at this stage. So hopefully that gives you just a very quick, idea of how you can interact with the system, just to extract that information. And this information can be exported if you wish to a CSV file, if you want to do some further analysis with inside Excel, should you wish. Let's move on to categories, because I really want to give you a bit of an example around how we've integrated with AIP, and show you how we can start to manage and protect our files. So I have a number of categories that I've created, a number of business cases that I've created, or business rules. One of them is AIP labels. So underneath, I've got a series of categories that are simply filtering files based upon the type of AIP label that's been assigned to them. So here you can see I've selected personal, and these are all the files that have that personal label assigned to them. So if I, for example, click on one of these files, this is the metadata, some of the metadata that's being collected, and here you will see the personal file, the personal label that's been assigned to this file. Okay, so that's the way we can very easily understand and see what kind of access rights have been given to what files. And of course, we can do additional, more granular analysis on these files should we wish. Let me give you one other example. So I've created earlier today another business rule that's looking for personal names and also medical records. So these are just files that contain personal names of individuals. So I'm not defining a personal name. I'm just saying if it contains a personal name, then I want to include it in my search. But I also want to I want to make sure that it contains probably the phrase in this word, medical record. And here you can see the system's come back and said there are a number of documents for us to meet that criteria. So I'm going to show you some of these files. Maybe we'll go for Jonathan. I'm going to extend Jonathan. So here you can see some of the metadata. Now, why I've extended this? I'm going to show you. I'm going to go and access this file. So this file resides in this location. So it's on this file share. It's in a test data, new data, and it's called Jonathan. So I'm going to change to another session just so I can show you how we can access this file. So I might have to create another session, so just bear with me 1 second. Well, I'm going to try to log on. Maybe I'll do it from here, it might be easier. So if I go into remote desktop, and then I'm going to connect to this server again. And I'm going to log on as a normal user. So just my normal user account. And then we're going to go down and we're going to try to find this file because I just want to show you how we can access. Now I happen to know this file lives in this file share. I think it was in new data. And I think it was called I'll take Joe, but that's George. We'll take George as a good example. So let's just check George and see what characteristics he's got assigned to him. So you can see this document is just a normal Word document. So we'll open up this document. I'll double click, and this will launch Word for us. And here you can see it's got a personal naming. So here's the personal name that we've detected at the very top. And it's a medical record. So that's the document that we're going to access. Now I'm going to close that file. And now I'm going to attempt to go back to my original session inside Control Point. So hopefully I can minimize this. And I will change it back from Jonathan and try to find, go back to the top. I think it was George Writer that we took, but if not, we'll check that again. So I'll take George, and then I'm going to assign the encryption policy to this file. Okay, so now, although I'm showing you this interactively, this can all be fully automated, so it would happen in the background quite happily without you doing anything, provided the business rules have been set up. So I'm just showing you how the process will happen in the background. So let's go into policies. And then I'm going to look at the encryption policy, because this is the thing that's actually doing the work, just to see how far we've got. It's refreshing at the moment, so you may see this either go up to 33 immediately, or you see there's something executing. Hopefully, if I'm quick enough, I'll say it's George. So this is the file that's actually being executed at the moment. So we'll let that process, and that should be fairly quickly. I'll just refresh that system to see where it's doing at the moment. But basically what's happening in the background is that control point is now going out to that file. It's first of all, it's checking the label that's been assigned to that file. It's then checking that the file is actually closed. And then it's saying, well, actually, if the files, if the labels match, I'm not going to do anything because it's correct. But actually, in this case, they won't, because we're going to encrypt it. It's going to change the label. And depending on the label we assigned, that will have different qualifiers within inside AIP. And in this case, it will encrypt the file. So at this stage, it's actually encrypted the file for us. Now, because the metadata has changed, what will happen in the background is that control point will be triggered now to update its metadata it has stored for that file. Hence, it will now George, the document George, will now be moved and will appear in the encryption under the encryption category. So let's go back and just see if I can still access that file. So I'm going to go back to my remote session, which again, remember, was just on my normal account. So I'm going to try to double click on this file again, and worthwhile noting that the date, modified date, hasn't changed. So we haven't updated the file. We've maintained the original information. So let me just come out of that and go back in just to make sure that it's correct. Right, I think it's this one that I modified. I'm just going to check that number, 907. Oh, maybe it was the other file, so correct me if I'm... Let me go back and just check that I've got the right document there, because there was another George up here, which is an 807. Let me double click on that one. Ah, that's obviously the document I changed. So what's happened is that we've now encrypted that. My account no longer has the privilege, and so I've been locked out. So the control point has automatically changed that protection for me. Now we can also change that protection back, or we can move that file. So control point is helping us to manage that information. So let me close this file again, and we'll just make sure that it was 807, so MR240807. So we'll go back again now to control point. I'll click on here. We'll scroll down to hopefully find, and there was George, 807. So yeah, unfortunately I opened the wrong file the first time, but that's the file that we've encrypted. So that's now been encrypted and has been modified by control point. So again, the user case that I mentioned before was all around how can we make sure that our users are assigning the correct access rights, and if necessary, it does contain sensitive information and needs to be encrypted. Has it been encrypted? And if it hasn't, well, actually, we need to take some action. Now, that action in the early days was purely notification, but of course now we've enhanced it so we can actually perform that encryption for our customer automatically. As I mentioned before, I've shown you how we interact with the system. That can all be fully automated in the background. So as files are created, and new files are ingested into control point, then the whole kind of categorization and the policy assignment will happen automatically. So let me take you through the final example, which I'm going to show you around DSARs. Because remember I mentioned that one particular customer we had a major problem with DSARs for emails. And here's an example of just a business rule that we've created to look for an email address with inside documents. Okay, and I'm just going to take a copy of this name just so I can show you in a bit more detail what the problem really was. So I'm just going to filter. I'm just going to put a filter on so you can see one particular message. So normally an email will have an original message at the bottom, And when you send that internally, normally your colleagues will reply, you might reply back. So you can start to build what's called an email conversation. And here you can see above the original email are all the email conversations that have happened. So in a DSAR request, what do you have to do? Well, really, you have to look at each of these individual messages, because maybe on the third or fourth reply, maybe that might contain some other sensitive information that's not relevant to the requesting party. So that information shouldn't be released, or maybe it should be redacted. So really, you have to review each of those, which can be very time consuming. Now, what we added for this customer originally was the ability, if you like, to the number represents the position of the response. So the higher the number would be the last reply. So in easy terms, what we could do is say, oh, okay, 76 is the higher number. That was the last message. So we can just look at that message because it will contain all the previous messages as well. So to give you an example, if I take the bottom one and we just view that message, here you just see that the original message, so nothing spectacular, but this is the first message. If I close that and go back and we go into 76 and then we view that message, here you would hopefully see just all the I go to the bottom, you can see all the reply messages that happened. So in an ideal world, we could just simply review this single document because we've got all the information is in there. But how do you identify this information? That's how do you find this top of email chain? And that tends to be quite difficult and very time consuming. So you might say from this screen, oh, it's easy to identify 76. I can go straight there. But we've only got 3 mailboxes with a small number of messages that we pulled together into our business rule. Just imagine if you've got 50, 100, 200, 500 mailboxes. Suddenly you'll end up with 2,000 messages. And trying to identify, if I just clear that filter, trying to identify the numbers, it becomes very messy, very error prone, time consuming. This one particular customer had 4 individuals every day just working on going through individual messages. It become very expensive and very time consuming. So we enhanced, again, control point to basically identify the top of an email chain only. So this is doing some additional capability where it's now purely identifying the top of the email chain so that we can simply reduce the number and we can simply view that document and then review all the other messages directly. So that's saving time and bear in mind you've only got 30 days and yes, you can apply for an extension, but you really want to make sure that you've got your data and you're managing your data and you're able to respond in an orderly fashion. So that would be definitely one of the questions I would recommend you take away. And if you're dealing with another vendor or you're talking around an existing system for doing DSARs, you should definitely ask the question, how do you deal with email chain messages? Because that proves to be a massive saving. So that was really all I was going to take you through for the demo today because of time. So if I go back to the presentation, I think I might have lost the presentation, but if we can go back to the presentation and really just to summarise where we are. So control point allows you basically to discover the relevant data. It allows you to start to manage that data. It allows you to start to build those categories and assign those policies to manage your data. There was a study done, I think 2 years ago, or it might have been last year, by Gartner and Forrester, which really puts control point at the very top of the magic quadrant in terms of leaders in this particular area. What's one unique for ourselves is that we have this unique capability where we are the only organization that can provide control point on a subscription basis, where all other vendors or other companies can only provide control point on a perpetual license basis. The subscription really provides customers with that much greater flexibility So you can really start small and grow throughout your organization and start to manage your data and add real value to your business, and make it really practical so that it delivers real practical value to what you're trying to achieve. We have a number of case studies that we're quite happy to share with you. Micro Focus have a number of case studies on their website. We're happy to share those, and we can send you that information should you require. I hope you found today useful. I'm going to hand back to Mark. Mark, I don't know if you want to just wrap up today's session, and then if necessary, we can go into any questions and answers you guys may have.
Sure, thank you, Martin. I appreciate it. It's very difficult to really show off what Control Point's full capabilities are in such a small space of time, but I think a lot of the points there that you covered are definitely a lot of the key ones. But as you and I both know, there's much more to the product. There are a couple of questions that people have put into the Q&A section, so we'll touch on those.
There was a question around ingestion times and how long would it take to ingest, I think 3 terabytes of data. And typically ingestion times are all dependent upon the makeup of the data. So for example, if you have millions, and typically we're dealing with millions of files, millions of small files, then that can take, for metadata ingestion, that's quite important because we have to extract the metadata from the header of the files. But typically 3 terabytes we would ingest overnight. So usually an overnight, probably in the region of between 8 and 10 hours, where the system would run through in the evening ingesting the data. Many of our customers run ingestions throughout the day because it isn't a very CPU intensive, it isn't memory intensive. It's simply almost scanning the file system. So and again, we have solutions for customers which they're ingesting, upwards of 50 terabytes of data. And bear in mind that once the initial ingestion is complete, then we're just basically doing an incremental to the rate of change, which is dramatically lower. The other beauty with the Control Point is very scalable, so we can have multiple ingestion connectors ingesting the data as well. There was a second question based around the licensing model. So Control Point is licensed on the amount of data ingested. So for a perpetual license, that's fixed at 5. You have to start at 5 terabytes. That's the minimum amount. For the subscription, we can go down to individual terabytes. So the smallest amount is 1 terabyte, and the subscription usually is based on a 12-month, but we can be very flexible in that period of time. I see one more question I can see, which is how difficult is it to create the business rules, the categories? It isn't very difficult at all. So one thing we provide is hands-on familiarization training, where we would train a small group of your staff on the system that's been deployed. And of course, during that process, we create a number of ingestions, we create a number of categories, a number of policies. So very much the users have those on their system to begin with, so they can use them as templates. And there are really only, I suppose, between 8 and 10 operators. So for example, and some proximity detectors. So it becomes very easy to start to pull together some fairly complex categories where you're searching your data. I can't see any more questions, so hopefully we've answered everything today. We'll be delighted to have a longer session with yourselves to give you a bit more detail around Control Point if you find that useful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Martin. Apologies, I don't know what happened with my microphone, but technology failed me is probably the best way of putting it. So again, thanks very much, and thanks to everyone who's managed to attend today. For those that are wanting to understand more around Control Point or any of the points that Martin's raised, you can get in contact with me direct if you email Mark Ryan, all one word, MarkRyan, at SES Escrow,
which is escrow.co.uk. Martin, I can't see any other questions that have come up myself, so I think that, at least from my point of view, wraps that up for today.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for your time, Mark. It's a real pleasure.
Okay, thank you all. Thanks, Martin.
Cheers. Bye-bye.